The proclamation echoed across the known lanes as carriers of light carried the decree from the marble halls of the Galactic Council to every listening world, every listening ship, and every listening mind that paid for the privilege of attention war. Had been declared against humanity. Banners of law were raised, and seals of authority were pressed into crystal memory, and the council speakers recited a long list of grievances that sounded complete and impressive and entirely certain of its own. Just as across the spiral arms, the reaction was immediate and dramatic as fleets began to turn, and factories shifted their rhythms, and markets trembled under the promise of conflict across one small blue world. The reaction was a pause in a meeting. As a screen refreshed and a single technician frowned and then returned to the work that mattered on Earth, the morning rolled forward, as it always had with trains. Sliding along rails and ships, lifting from pads and voices, calling greetings across streets and water and air. No sirens sounded and no emergency broadcasts cut into the flow of ordinary life. Decree arrived through channels that were legally correct and formally severe, yet they arrived alongside advertisements and weather updates and transit notices, and so they blended into the noise like a distant note in a crowded song in a research complex by a northern sea. A team watched a simulation bloom and collapse, and bloom again as they argued about power, flow, and materials fatigue. And the difference between elegance and reliability? I leaned back and rubbed tired eyes and said that the model needed one more pass. Leo nodded and pushed a tray of data aside and asked if anyone wanted to. Mira laughed and said she would take anything that was not nutrient paste. They were building a network that would spread across orbits and moons and stations, and it was meant to be boring by design. Because boring systems kept people alive, the war notice scrolled on a side panel and then vanished under layers of priority that belonged to storms and solar flares and routine alerts that had names. People recognized on another continent. Eli walked into a classroom and faced a group of students who were restless and curious and impatient with theory. He spoke about momentum and energy in the stubborn way of reality. It's demanded payment for every shortcut, and he wrote symbols on a board with a hand that moved quickly and surely. A student raised a hand and asked about the rumors. Online. Eli smiled and said that rumors traveled faster than truth, and that homework traveled slower than either, and then he assigned a problem that made the room. Groaning low orbit, a cargo pilot named Tom adjusted a vector and hummed as the ship responded, and he thought about dinner and the message he needed to send to a friend and the way the planet turned beneath him. With careless grace, the war notice pinged his console, and he marked it red without opening the attachment because he was late, and because notices always exaggerated, and because insurance did not pay faster when one panicked far away. The council watched and waited and mistook silence for fear, sent observers and scouts and heralds, and they returned with reports that made no sense within the neat boxes of doctrine. Human fleets did not scramble, and human borders did not bristle. Traffic increased and trade expanded and messages multiplied, and none of them carried the tone of a species bracing for extinction. Some council members argued that the humans were hiding preparations behind a curtain of noise. Others argued that humans were naive and unready and arrogant in their neglect. The chair called for patience, and patience was granted because the chair had a voice that could still a hall. Weeks passed, and the first skirmish occurred at a relay node that humans had built for redundancy, and then forgotten because redundancy meant forgetting was allowed. A council patrol fired warning shots and received no reply, and then fired again, and the relay folded itself into a safe mode and rerouted traffic without drama. The patrol reported victory, and the council marked a point on a map. The map meant little on Earth, where planners noticed a blip and rerouted shipments and sent a polite inquiry through channels that assumed malfunction. Rather than Malasiva, read the inquiry and shrugged and said it looked like a calibration. Aramira suggested sending a patch, and Leo asked if they should include an apology just in case they did, and the apology was sincere, and the patch worked, and the relay returned to service without fanfare. The patrol commander fumed and wrote a report that demanded escalation. Escalation came in the form of a larger fleet, and a louder announcement, and a timetable that assumed resistance would bloom on Kutha. Fleet crossed a border that humans did not recognize as a border, and they were greeted by traffic controllers, who asked them to file a plan and observe safety lanes. The request was ignored, and the controllers rerouted everything else, and sent a warning about debris hazards. The first exchange that could be called a battle occurred when a Council cruiser attempted to disable a station that managed fuel and water for passing vessels. The station did not fire back because it had no weapons and because its protocols prioritized containment and continuity. Sealed compartments and shunted flows and spun-down reactors in a pattern that engineers had practiced, and then it waited when the cruiser fired again. The station moved because moving was cheaper than repairing, and because its thrusters were designed to nudge mass rather than to fight. The shot missed, and the cruiser overcorrected and clipped its own escort, and the Council channels filled with shouting on Earth. A safety bulletin went out about unexpected traffic in high orbit and a reminder to update navigation software. The war finally became real for humans when shipping delays affected a festival schedule and a sports league postponed, a match complaints surged and planners convened and analysts pulled threads until patterns emerged. Eli joined a call and listened as voices layered concern and curiosity. Tom sent a message from orbit with a short clip of a foreign hull and asked if anyone recognized the design. Mira pulled up archives and found Council symbology and laughed softly and said that explained the tone. The network Ava was building suddenly mattered in a way that made funding committees move faster. The response that followed was not a mobilization but an optimization. Humans did not rush to arms but to meetings and models and margins. They mapped flows and incentives and failure modes, and then they adjusted the world they already had. Stations gained autonomy and ships gained better guidance, and traffic became smoother under pressure rather than brittle. Council fleets tried to disrupt trade. They found trade slipping around them like water. When they tried to seize resources, they found contracts that reconfigured supply and left nothing worth seizing. When they tried to provoke a decisive clash, they found none because humans refused the stage. The Council demanded battle, and humanity replied with invoices and safety notices and requests for clarification. Some Council captains fired out of frustration and found their weapons systems confused by layers of civilian interference that obeyed laws the Council itself had written. Ava presented a report that showed casualty curves bending downward as exposure decreased. Leo asked if they were doing enough, and Myra said that enough was a moving target, and that motion was the pointial. Watch students debate ethics and strategy, and he guided them toward the idea that power could be expressed as restraint. Tom escorted a convoy through a storm and trusted the network and arrived. Early months passed, and Council morale thinned as victories refused to appear. The chair called an emergency session, and the hall filled with voices that once sounded certain and now sounded tired. Observers reported that humans were still not afraid and that their lives looked much the same, except for better logistics and fewer accidents. Delegate asked how a species could be so calm under threat, and another answered that perhaps the threat was Miss Freemuth. Chair requested contact on terms that allowed dignity to remain. Humans accepted and sent a small team with engineers and diplomats and teachers. They spoke plainly and without triumph, and they offered data and proposals and a path that avoided humiliation. They explained that humanity had grown under storms and shortages, and that survival had taught them to value systems over symbols. They explained that war was a blunt tool, and that blunt tools broke things that took time to fix. The Council listened because exhaustion had opened space for listening. The proclamation was revised, and then rescinded, and then archived with language that allowed everyone to save face. Trade resumed, and the lanes grew busy again. Earth, the news cycle moved on, and people argued about ordinary things and planned ordinary futures. Eva closed a file and smiled and said the network would hold. Lee erased a board and assigned a new problem. Tom set a course and hummed. Humanity barely noticed the war, because humanity had learned to build worlds that did not need to notice to endure.